Before anything else, a woman standing alone in the middle of a glittering Manhattan ballroom, her hand pressed to her face, her eyes dry. Not because she wasn't hurting, because she had already decided. Celeste Marrow smiled from across the room, wine on her white dress, tears on her cheeks and satisfaction in her eyes that only Alessandra could see. Ronan Vescari, the most feared man in that building, had just raised his hand against his 7-month pregnant wife. In public, in front of cameras, in front of everyone. And Celeste had planned every single second of it. That night, Alessandra made a choice that no amount of apology could ever undo. If this story made your chest tighten in the first 30 seconds, you're exactly where this story needs you. Subscribe to this channel and follow this all the way to the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Hit the like button, drop your city or country. In the comments, I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The night of the gala, Alessandra Ves spent 45 minutes in front of a bathroom mirror that cost more than her childhood apartment. Not because she was vain, because she was stalling. She pressed both palms flat against the cold marble vanity and stared at the woman looking back at her, the swollen belly she still wasn't used to, the dark circles she'd gotten very good at hiding, the dress that had taken Ronan's personal stylist 3 fittings to get right. 7 months pregnant and standing in a $4,500 gown at a charity event she hadn't wanted to attend. For an organization she barely knew, surrounded by people she had spent 4 years learning how to smile at correctly. This was her life now. She exhaled slowly and pressed one hand against the side of sounds of her stomach, where the baby had been kicking since the car ride over. Her daughter. She hadn't told Ronan the gender yet. She'd been waiting for the right moment, which, lately, felt like a moment that kept refusing to arrive. 5 more minutes, she said quietly to herself, to the baby, to whoever was listening. Then she picked up her clutch and walked out. The ballroom of the Saint. Regis was already full when she emerged from the elevator, the kind of full that meant 300 people pressed into a space designed for 250, champagne circulating on silver trays, a string quartet playing something classical in the corner that nobody was actually listening to. Chandeliers the size of small cars, women in dresses that cost as much as a car payment, men in suits that cost as much as a semester of college. And Ronan, at the center of it all, the way he always was. He was standing near the bar with 2 of his captains, Gino Ferrante, and a newer man Alessandra had only met twice, whose name she could never remember, and he was laughing at something. A real laugh. She could tell the difference by now. Performance laugh was deeper, slower, designed to project ease and control. This one was genuine quick, a little rough around the edges, the kind that showed his teeth. He looked up when she entered. For exactly 2 seconds, something real crossed his face. Something that used to feel like hers. Then his jaw set, and he looked back at his conversation. Alessandra didn't stop walking. She crossed the ballroom with her chin level and her back straight and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and found a woman she vaguely knew from a previous fundraiser, somethings. Elena, the wife of a real estate developer, and began a conversation about landscaping. She was fine. She was perfectly fine. She was trying so hard to be fine that the effort of it was physically exhausting. The trouble had started, as it often does, the way that a slow leak starts, not with a crash but with a drip. Something small enough to rationalize. Something that, by the time you noticed the water spreading across the floor, had already been happening for months. Celeste Marrow had come back to New York in October. Ronan hadn't mentioned it. Alessandra had found out through a mutual contact, a woman named Donna, who moved in both the legitimate and the less legitimate circles of Manhattan society and knew everything about everyone and kept it all filed neatly behind a bright smile. Donna had said it almost casually. The way you mentioned the weather or traffic, did you hear Celeste is back? She's doing something in private equity now, I think. And Alessandra had nodded and smiled and taken a long sip of whatever was in her glass, and then had gone home and sat very still in the bedroom for a long time. She knew who Celeste was. Every woman who had married into the Vescari world knew who Celeste was. Not because Ronan had told her he hadn't. Not really. Not directly. But because the past has a way of staying visible, if you know where to look. Celeste Marrow had been the woman before Alessandra. For 3 years, she had existed in Ronan's orbit the way some women did, not quite a relationship, not quite an arrangement. Somewhere in the complicated space between the two that powerful men sometimes use to avoid having to choose. She was beautiful in the kind of effortless, weaponized way that certain women mastered: dark hair, high cheekbones, the kind of mouth that made it hard to trust her with anything you actually cared about. When Ronan had married Alessandra 2 years ago, Celeste had left the city. Now she was back, and in the 6 weeks since her return, Ronan had started disappearing in the evenings again. He had explanations. He always had explanations. Business meetings that ran late. Supply chain negotiations that couldn't happen during regular hours. A problem with one of his legitimate development projects that required personal attention. Alessandra didn't push back. She had learned very early in this marriage that pushing back with Ronan Vescari required choosing your battles carefully, and she was currently in the business of trying to reach her 3rd trimester without any more stress than was strictly necessary. But she wasn't stupid. She noticed the explanations were getting smoother the more she started asking. And smooth explanations, in her experience, were the ones that had been practiced. She was standing near the window with Elena the landscaper when she felt it, the particular shift in atmosphere that meant Celeste Marrow had entered a room. It wasn't a sound exactly. It was more the way other people reacted to her, the slight turning of heads, the subtle repositioning that attractive, ambitious women triggered in social spaces like this one. Alessandra didn't look over immediately. She took a deliberate sip of her water and kept her face arranged in an expression of polite interest in whatever Elena was saying about Japanese maples. Then she looked. Celeste was in white. Of course she was. Ivory white, technically, a shade that walked the line between appropriate and bridal with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Strapless, the kind of dress that required either surgery or genetics, and Celeste appeared to have been born for it. She was with 2 other women, an escort formation, that suggested she'd planned this arrival, and she moved through the room with the ease of someone who had been in this ballroom many times before. Which she had, probably more times than Alessandra. Alessandra turned back to Elena and the Japanese maples and said something about pruning schedules that must have been coherent, because Elena nodded and continued. 20 minutes later, Celeste appeared at her elbow. Alessandra. The voice was warm, socially practiced, the kind of warmth that was indistinguishable from the real thing if you didn't know what to listen for. You look absolutely radiant. Pregnancy suits you. Alessandra had dealt with women like this before. You smiled. You matched the warmth exactly, degree for degree. You gave them nothing that could be used against you later. Celeste, she said pleasantly, I didn't realize you'd be here tonight. Oh, I try to support the foundation whenever I can. A smile. Exactly the right kind, generous, benign. The smile of a woman who had no reason to be threatened by anyone in this room. I'm so glad you're both here. Ronan looks well. There it was. Not you look well. Ronan looks well. A small thing. The kind of thing that, if you mentioned it to someone later, they would say you were being oversensitive. And maybe you were. Alessandra had asked herself that question enough times that she no longer fully trusted her own judgment on the subject. He is, she said simply. The conversation lasted 3 more minutes. Then Celeste excused herself, and Alessandra stood very still and watched her walk toward the bar, where Ronan was standing, and watched Ronan clock her arrival, the way men clocked the arrival of women who still meant something to them, even when they didn't mean to. He recovered quickly. He always recovered quickly. But Alessandra had seen it. She spent the next hour doing what she had become very good at doing, being present in a room where she felt fundamentally alone. She talked to Marcella Vescari, Ronan's mother, for a while. Marcella was a complicated woman, somewhere in her mid-60s, with the kind of bearing that came from surviving decades of a particular kind of life and deciding to survive it with her chin up. She had a sharpness to her that Alessandra had initially found frightening and eventually come to respect. Marcella had watched Celeste's entrance, too. Alessandra had caught her eyes during it, and something had passed between them that neither of them put into words. The evening wore on. The string quartet shifted to something livelier. People drank. People laughed. The charity part of the event involved a short speech and a check presentation that lasted 10 minutes and was really just a photo opportunity with extra steps, and then the drinking continued. Alessandra was making her way toward the edge of the room. Her back was aching. She needed to sit. She was 7 months pregnant and had been standing in heels for 3 hours, and she was done pretending that was fine when she felt a hand close around her wrist. Not a greeting, not accidental contact. A grip. She turned. Celeste was there, close, closer than social proximity should have allowed, close enough that Alessandra could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral that had probably been specifically chosen to be memorable. And Celeste's face, the face that had been warm and socially appropriate all evening, was different now. Something in the eyes that Alessandra had time, only to register before it all began to move. Celeste pulled her own arm back, hard, in a motion that looked from any distance like she was reacting to being grabbed. The wineglass in her other hand tilted, and red deep, staining, irreversible red cascaded across the front of her white dress. And then, in a move that must have been practiced, because it was too smooth, too complete, too perfectly calibrated to look accidental, Celeste threw herself backward. The crash of her hitting the floor was loud enough to silence the nearest 30 people. And then 30 became 60, and 60 became the entire room, and the entire room went still and turned, and stared at Alessandra Valle Vescari, 7 months pregnant, standing alone in the middle of the Saint. Regis Ballroom, a woman collapsed at her feet, a broken wineglass scattering across the marble. Alessandra's whole body went cold. She started to say something. She opened her mouth. She looked down at Celeste, who was already making the particular sounds of a woman in pain, soft, controlled, calibrated to carry, and then she looked up and saw Ronan crossing the room. He was already angry before he reached her. She could see it in his stride, the particular set of his shoulders when his temper was running ahead of his judgment, which happened more than people who feared him might have expected. Because Ronan Vescari's greatest flaw had always been that he made decisions at the speed of his anger, and then had to spend the rest of his time living with them. He reached Celeste first. He crouched down. He said something to her in a low voice. Celeste, still on the floor, still making those careful, measured sounds, said something back, and Alessandra couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to, because she could see what Celeste's eyes were doing. Celeste's eyes were looking directly at her, and they were bright with something that had nothing to do with pain. Ronan stood. He turned to Alessandra. "What the hell did you do?" His voice wasn't loud. That was the thing about Ronan, he rarely needed to be loud. Volume was for men who needed to perform power. Ronan had the kind of voice that had real weight behind it, the kind that pressed into the room without needing to raise itself. And so when he looked at his pregnant wife and said that, the nearest 50 people heard it with perfect clarity. "I didn't," Alessandra started. "Don't." He moved closer. "Don't stand there." And Ronan. She said his name the way you say someone's name when you're trying to reach through a closed door. "Listen to me." She grabbed my wrist. She pulled the glass herself. "I need you to listen. There are cameras in this room." He said it through his teeth, quiet and terrible. "There are 300 people in this room. And you think I can't see what just happened here? That's exactly why you need to hear me," she said. "Because there are cameras. Because there are witnesses. Because what you think you saw is not," she saw it coming. She didn't fully believe it until it happened, because there was still some part of her, the part that had spent 2 years married to this man, that had chosen him, that was carrying his daughter, that could not fully believe he would do it. Not here. Not in front of everyone. Not with her belly visible between them, round and obvious, and there. But Ronan Vescari did not stop to think about that. His hand caught her across the face, not a closed fist. An open hand. She would tell herself that later, in the way that people find the smallest possible distinctions when trying to process something that has no good explanation. An open hand, as if the specific shape of violence had any bearing on what it meant. The sound of it traveled. In a room gone that quiet, it traveled far. Alessandra's head turned with the impact. She felt the sting of it bloom up through her cheek, and then spread, the way these things spread. She stood completely still for a moment, one breath, two with her hand not at her face but at her belly, a reflex, both palms flat against the swell of her daughter, checking, just checking. Then she straightened. She did not cry. She would not give this room her tears. She looked at her husband, at Ronan Vescari, feared and powerful, and currently looking at her with something she couldn't quite name, something that wasn't entirely anger anymore, something that had cracks in it, and she said, in a voice that was very quiet and very steady, "When you find out the truth, don't come looking for me." Then she turned and walked toward the exit. The room let her pass. Ronan didn't move to stop her. Celeste, getting to her feet now with the careful help of two concerned bystanders, watched her go, and for just a moment, just a fraction of one, the bright, satisfied thing in her eyes flickered into something that might have been uncertainty. But it passed. She was sure of herself. She had planned this down to the last detail, and it had worked exactly as she'd intended it to. She wasn't wrong about that. She was only wrong about what came next. Alessandra stepped out of the St. Regis and into the cold November air and stood on the sidewalk for 20 seconds, with her eyes closed, her hand on her stomach, and made a decision so quietly that no one would have noticed it from the outside. The decision wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about Ronan. It was about Lucia, a name she had already chosen without telling anyone, and about the fact that her daughter was not going to be born into a world where that was acceptable. Not the slap, not the believing without listening, not the years of careful explanations and smoother lies, not the life of standing in borrowed dresses in borrowed rooms, hoping to be seen clearly by a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that she was not quite worth the effort of trusting. She got into the town car, alone. She didn't cry on the way home either. She had already stopped reaching for the version of this marriage that has always been slightly out of her grip. What she reached for instead was something harder and more real, the quiet to terrifying sound shape of a life she was going to have to build entirely by herself. She was 7 months along. She was in a city that belonged to the Vescaris. She had very little money of her own, and no career she could step back into immediately, and a name that had opened certain doors and would certainly close others. None of that mattered as much as it might have, an hour ago. Because an hour ago she had still been trying, and now, pressing her palm flat against the window glass as the car moved through Manhattan traffic, watching the lights streak and blur, Alessandra was done trying. She was making a plan. The mansion was quiet when Alessandra got home. That was the first thing she noticed, not the marble floors, or the portrait of Ronan's father in the entryway, or the enormous floral arrangement that got replaced every Monday, whether anyone looked at it or not. She noticed the quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists in houses that are too large for the number of people actually living in them. She stood in the entryway for a moment with her coat still on. The housekeeper, a small Honduran woman named Carmen, who had worked for the Vescari family for 11 years, and had the discretion of someone who had seen enough to know that discretion was a survival skill, appeared from the hallway and stopped when she saw Alessandra's face. Carmen didn't say anything. She just looked. "I'm fine," Alessandra said. Carmen's expression said she didn't believe that, but she was too professional to argue. "Can I get you anything, Mrs. Vescari? Something to eat? Some tea?" "No." Then, because Carmen didn't deserve the edge in her voice, "Thank you. I'm going to go upstairs." Carmen nodded. She stepped back, but she watched Alessandra move toward the staircase with the particular watchfulness of someone who had noticed things before, that she wished she'd acted on sooner. Alessandra went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed, and Wendy, in her expensive dress and her expensive shoes, and put both hands on her stomach and breathed. In, out. The baby was still. She'd been more active earlier. During the ride to the gala, little insistent flutters that Alessandra had pressed her palm against in the back of the car, while Ronan stared at his phone. Now she was quiet, as if even she could feel that something had shifted. "We're okay," Alessandra said softly, to her belly, to the dark room. "We're okay." She didn't believe it yet, but she was going to need to practice saying it until she did. She sat there for a long time, not crying, not moving, just sitting with the fact of what had happened. She was good at this, at processing things in private, in the space between the event and whatever came next. She'd learned it young, from a mother who had operated on the philosophy that emotions, expressed, were liabilities. She'd spent most of her adult life trying to unlearn it. Now she was grateful for it, and the ugly sometimes become grateful for the hard things that made you. At some point, she got up, took off the dress, and hung it carefully in the closet. She wasn't sure why. Force of habit, maybe. Or maybe she just needed her hands to do something practical. She stood in the walk-in closet for a long moment, looking at the row of Ronan's suits on one side and her dresses on the other, and she felt something clarify in her chest the way things clarify when you stop, hoping they'll turn out differently. She reached for the suitcase on the upper shelf, not the large one. The medium one, the one she'd taken on a work trip to Milan 3 years ago, before she was married, before she had become Alessandra Vescari instead of Alessandra Weil. She pulled it down and set it on the floor of the closet and opened it and stood there looking at the empty interior. Then she began. Not frantically. Not the way they showed it in movies. Clothes yanked from hangers, things thrown without thought. Deliberately. Carefully. She packed the way she'd always packed for trips, the things she actually needed, the things that were actually hers. Clothes that had been hers before the marriage. Her own jewelry, the pieces from her grandmother, not the Vescari diamonds. Her passport from the inner pocket of the fireproof safe, whose code Ronan didn't know she'd figured out, because she'd learned his patterns and he'd never thought to change them. Her medical records, including every ultrasound photograph, including the one where you could see very clearly, if you knew what to look for, that the baby was a girl. She worked quietly and without stopping for 2.5 hours. At 2 in the morning, she sat on the bedroom floor with the packed suitcase beside her and counted the money in the envelope she'd kept in the back of her personal documents folder, an old habit she'd never mentioned to Ronan. Money she'd set aside slowly, over the course of 2 years from her own account, never enough to be noticed, always enough to represent something. $11,400. Not much, not for the life she'd been living. More than enough for the life she was choosing now. She took her wedding ring off last. She set it on the nightstand. She looked at it for a moment at the diamond that Ronan had placed on her finger in front of 70 people in a ceremony that she had genuinely, in those early months, believed meant something to both of them. Then she looked away. She picked up a pen and pulled a sheet of paper from the desk drawer and wrote 3 sentences. She put it beside the ring. She did not read it back. She didn't need to. She knew what it said. She was gone before 4 in the morning. Carmen was in the kitchen when Alessandra came downstairs with the suitcase, which meant Carmen had not gone to bed, which meant Carmen had been waiting. Carmen looked at the suitcase and then looked at Alessandra's face and then said nothing for exactly the right amount of time. Then she reached into her apron pocket and took out a folded piece of paper and held it out. Alessandra unfolded it. It was an address, and a name, a woman's name, someone Alessandra didn't recognize. "My cousin Carmen," said quietly. "She has a place in Queens. Clean, safe, 2 bedrooms. She doesn't talk." Alessandra looked at the address. "You don't have to. I've been working in this house for 11 years, Carmen said. "I should have done something a long time ago." She paused. "She's a good woman, my cousin. She'll have the room ready." Alessandra's throat tightened in the way it did when something genuine caught her off guard. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. Carmen nodded like it was, and Alessandra walked out of the Vescari mansion and got into a cab that Carmen had already called, and the house got smaller in the rear window, and then the street, and then the whole neighborhood, until all of it was just city again. She called the cab company instead of a rideshare. No app record. She was already thinking that way. She had $11,000 and a name in Queens and 7 weeks until her due date, and she had made a decision that she was not going to take back. Ronan came home at 6:30 in the morning. He had left the gala 40 minutes after Alessandra walked out, which was 20 minutes longer than he should have. And he had spent that time doing something he was not accustomed to, standing in a corner of the ballroom with a glass of bourbon he didn't drink, running the scene back through his head with the particular sick feeling of a man who already knows what he's going to find when he looks more carefully. He'd expected her to be in the bedroom, asleep or pretending, or sitting up waiting, ready for the argument, because Alessandra was not the kind of woman who dissolved into silence. She had a temper she kept controlled, but he knew it was there. He knew her, or he told himself he knew her. That was the thing that was starting to come apart on the drive home, the certainty that he knew her, that he understood the situation, that he had responded to what he'd actually seen. The bedroom was empty. He stood in the doorway and looked at the neatly made bed and felt the back of his neck go cold. He checked the bathroom, the closet. He opened the closet door and stood there cataloging. Her dresses were there, most of them, but certain things were missing. Not the gala-type things, not the performance clothes. Personal things, the kind of things you packed when you were not planning on coming back. He saw the ring on the nightstand before he saw the paper. He sat down heavily on the bed. He picked up the ring, held it in his palm. It was warm still, somehow, or maybe that was just his hand. Couldn't tell. Then he read the paper. It was 3 sentences. He read them 4 times. Then he set the paper down and sat very still, with his hands on his knees, and stared at the far wall. He did not call his captains. He didn't reach for his phone. He sat in the bedroom where his pregnant wife had packed a suitcase at 2 in the morning and thought about what he had done, and it was the thinking that was the worst part, the way the scene kept replaying, the way his own hand moved in the memory, the sound of it, the way she had not flinched, but had instead put both hands on her belly, as if that were her first concern. 'Cause it was. He sat there until 7:15. Then his phone rang. It was his mother. He let it ring 3 times before he picked up. "I'm coming over," Marcella Vescari said, without greeting, without preamble. Don't argue with me. I'm already in the car." She paused, and in the pause he could hear the quality of her silence, which was different from most people's silence. Heavier. "There's something you need to see." She was at the mansion by 8. She walked in the way she always walked into this house, like she still owned it, which, in a certain sense, she always would, regardless of paperwork, and she went straight to the living room and set her bag down and turned to face her son. Marcella Vescari had lines in her face that had been earned, not treated. She had spent 30 years married to a man whose world looked a lot like Ronan's world, and she had survived it the way strong women survived things, not by pretending it was something it wasn't, but by knowing exactly what it was and choosing her battles accordingly. She looked at her son now with the particular expression she reserved for moments when he had done something that she had known, somewhere in herself, was coming. Not surprise, something colder, something that was almost a verdict. "Did she call you?" Ronan said. "No." Marcella set her phone on the coffee table and turned it toward him. "Your head of security sent me this 40 minutes ago. He thought I should see it before you did." On the screen was a video file. The timestamp said 9:47 p.m. The St. Regis. Security camera angle from the far end of the ballroom, elevated, the kind of angle that captured the whole room and nobody thought much about. Ronan picked up the phone and pressed play. He watched. The footage was clear, clearer than he would have wanted it to be. He watched Celeste approach Alessandra from the left. He watched the grip, not a touch, a grip, deliberate, Celeste's fingers closing around Alessandra's wrist and pulling. He watched the glass tilt at an angle that was not consistent with someone who had been pushed or startled. He watched Celeste's body go back in a controlled fall, the kind that looked bad but didn't actually hurt, the kind someone practiced. He watched Alessandra's hands go out as if to catch her. He watched his own wife trying to help, and then he watched himself come across that room. He watched the whole thing, start to finish, and by the end his hands were very still and his face had gone to a place. It went sometimes when he was working something out that had no good answer. He set the phone down. "There's more," Marcella said. Her voice was measured. She was working to keep it that way. Alberto found other footage. From the hallway camera, around 30 minutes earlier. Celeste and a man I don't recognize, near the service corridor. Alberto is looking into who he is. What were they doing? Talking. Close. Looking at something on a phone together. Marcella paused. The way people look at something they've planned. The room was very quiet. "She set it up," Ronan said. It wasn't a question. Marcella didn't answer him right away. She sat down in the chair across from the sofa and folded her hands in her lap and looked at her son with that expression that was a verdict. "Where's Alessandra?" she said. "Gone." "Gone where?" "I don't know." He said it plainly. Two words that, in his world, were almost never true, because, in his world, knowing the location of everyone who mattered was a basic operating requirement. She packed while I was still at the gala. Carmen called a cab. I already talked to Carmen, and Carmen told you what? That she helped her. He looked at his mother, that she had been waiting for something like this to happen. Marcella absorbed that without comment. Then she stood and walked to the window that overlooked the back garden, a garden that cost an unreasonable amount of money to maintain, and that neither of them had ever spent real time in, and stood there with her back to her son. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." Before last night, she didn't turn around. The past few weeks, the late nights, the how much of what Celeste was suggesting, through whatever means she was using to suggest it. Did you actually believe? And how much of it were you ready to believe before she ever said a word? Silence. Ronan. "I don't know." "Yes, you do." He put his hands on his knees and stared at the floor. "There were things that looked, I thought she was." He stopped. Started again. "Celeste had sent me photographs. 3 weeks ago. Alessandra with a man at a restaurant. The angle made it look. Photographs." Marcella turned around now. "That Celeste sent you. That you received 3 weeks ago." She let that sit. "Did you ask Alessandra about them?" Silence. "Did you look into where they actually came from? Who took them? Whether they were real?" More silence. "Did you do anything at all except carry them around in your head for 3 weeks until you walked into a ballroom primed to believe the worst?" Ronan said nothing. Marcella's voice didn't rise. She was past the age of raising her voice. The control in it was worse than shouting. "She is 7 months pregnant with your daughter. And she is somewhere in this city with a suitcase and $11,000 because I know my daughter-in-law well enough to know she would have had money set aside. She was too smart not to, and she's somewhere she doesn't feel safe enough to stay where I can find her. And you need to understand something about that." "I understand what I did. Do you?" She crossed back to the center of the room and stood in front of him. "Then say it, out loud. Not to punish yourself, because I need to know whether you actually understand it." Ronan looked up at his mother. "I hit her." The words came out flat and without decoration. "She was pregnant. She was trying to tell me the truth, and I didn't let her finish. I believed someone else over my own wife without checking a single thing, and then I hit her in front of 300 people. Why? Because I was angry. Because you were angry," Marcella repeated. "That's the word for it. What else would I call it? I'd call it convenience. You were angry, and she was there, and you had already decided she was guilty, so the anger had a place to go." She paused. "Your father did that. You know that. I watched it for 30 years, and I always told myself it was different in your case, because you had seen what it did. I told myself that a long time. Last night was the first time I admitted I was wrong." The room was very quiet. The thing about Marcella Vescari was that she did not say things she didn't mean, and she did not exaggerate for effect. And she had spent enough years choosing her words in high-stakes environments that when she deployed one, it landed with the weight it deserved. Ronan felt it land. He didn't say anything for a long time. "Then, I need to find her. She doesn't want to be found. She's pregnant. She is a grown woman who has made a decision, and she made it with full information, which is more than you did last night." Marcella picked up her bag. "You will not send your men to look for her. You will not use your network to track her location. You will let me try to make contact through channels she might actually trust." She looked at her son. And in the meantime, you're going to deal with Celeste Marrow. The name landed differently in that room than it had in months. It landed like what it actually was. Alberto has more? Ronan said. Alberto has been making calls since 5 this morning. He's found 3 separate people who received money from an account connected to one of Celeste's holding companies, a woman on your household staff, a man who works for the communications firm that handles your events, and someone at the medical office where Alessandra has her prenatal appointments. Marcella's voice was very controlled. Someone at her medical office, Ronan. He stood up. The movement was slow and very deliberate, which, in his case, was more dangerous than if it had been sudden. The photographs you received, Marcella continued. Alberto is certain they were staged. The man in them works for a photography studio that Celeste used for an event 18 months ago. Same man who was with her in the corridor last night. Ronan walked to the window. He stood there with his back to his mother the way she had stood with her back to him. Outside, the garden was silver and cold in the November morning light. A groundskeeper he didn't know by name was raking something near the east wall. She intercepted messages Alberto had told him on the phone at 7 a.m. His voice, the careful voice of a man delivering information he would rather not have to deliver. We believe she had access to one of your personal email accounts. The account you used for household matters. A pause. Including the account Mrs. Vescari sometimes used to communicate with you. Ronan had not said anything then either. He turned now and looked at his mother. If Alessandra had tried to reach me, he said slowly, through that account, over the past 2 months, Marcella looked at him steadily. She sent you 4 messages, she said. Alberto found them in a deleted folder that hadn't been properly wiped. One of them was about the photographs you'd received. She somehow suspected you had them, though she didn't know what they showed. She was trying to explain. A beat. She sent it 6 days ago. 6 days ago. 6 days ago, Ronan had slept on the same side of the bed as his wife and eaten breakfast across from her, and had not known that she had been trying to reach through the wall between them, and he had not felt it, because the wall had been bricked up from the outside. He sat back down, not because he was tired, although he was, because something happened in his legs that required sitting. She thought I was ignoring her, he said. She thought you already knew everything you wanted to know. Marcella stood by the door. She came to that gala last night because she still thought there was something salvageable. She told Carmen that. She told Carmen she was going to try one more time to find a way to reach you. He didn't respond. Instead, Marcella said, you gave her a definitive answer. She left him with that. He sat in the living room of his enormous house for a long time. He could hear the staff moving elsewhere in the building, the housekeeper, the cook, people doing their jobs with the practiced invisibility of people who had learned to move around the moods of powerful men. He thought about all of them, about how many people he had built his life on top of, all of these invisible structures, all of this labor and discretion and silent accommodation, and how he had managed to lose the one person who had chosen to be there. She hadn't been paid to stay. She has been choosing every day to stay. And he had spent 2 years taking that choice for granted, and 6 weeks letting someone poison it, and one night destroying whatever was left of it with his own hand. He picked up his phone and called Alberto. Celeste Marrow, he said. Everything we have, every account, every connection, every business she runs or has any stake in. I want to know who funded her return to New York. I want to know what she actually has and what she owes. And I want to know the full extent of what she accessed in my systems. He paused. Today, Alberto said he would get on it. Ronan ended the call and sat there with the phone in his hand. The ring was still on the nightstand upstairs. He hadn't brought it down. He wasn't sure what to do with it. He knew what it meant, what it had to mean, but there was some part of him that wasn't ready to look at the fact of it in the cold light of the living room. Up there, it was a private thing. Down here, it would be a reality he had to move around in. He went upstairs, eventually. He stood in the closet and looked at the space where her things had been and felt something he was not going to name because naming it would require him to be more honest with himself than he currently had the structural capacity for. He was not a man who felt powerless easily, but he felt it now. This was not the kind of situation he could solve with money or force or reputation. He couldn't send men. He couldn't make calls. He couldn't negotiate his way into a position of leverage, because there was no leverage available to him that wasn't the exact kind of thing that would prove everything she had already decided about him. The only thing he had was time, and the understanding, which arrived slowly and without kindness, that she had not left to punish him. She had left because the place she'd been standing had become genuinely unsafe, and she had finally acknowledged that to herself, and there was no amount of his remorse that changed the fact of what had made it unsafe in the first place. He was still standing in the closet when his phone rang again. "Alberto. Boss. There's something else." Alberto's voice had that quality it got when the information was bad enough that he was pre-managing his own delivery. "Celeste's financial records, the account that paid the household employee, it's been active for 8 months. Ronan went still. 8 months. Not 6 weeks since she'd returned. Not a recent plan, developed after she came back and assessed the situation. 8 months. She started this before she came back to New York, Ronan said. 2 months before, yes, from what we can tell." A pause. "This was never about opportunity, boss. She planned the return around the plan." Closet was very quiet. Somewhere below him, a door closed. A normal house sound. A sound that, until this morning, he had never particularly noticed. "There's one more thing," Alberto said. "The man at the medical office. What about him? We think he passed Celeste information about Mrs. Vescari's prenatal appointments, her schedule, possibly the gender of the baby. The gender of the baby. That Alessandra had not told him. That he had not known. That Celeste, that's 8 months into a calculated operation designed to destroy his marriage, potentially knew before he did." He set the phone down without ending the call and stood in his wife's empty closet and understood, with a clarity that had arrived far too late to do anything useful, exactly what had been happening, and why and for how long. He had not been living his marriage. He had been living Celeste's version of it. He was still standing there, in that stillness, when Alberto's voice came faint from the phone on the shelf. "Boss? Still there?" Ronan picked the phone up. "Get me everything," he said. "I want it bulletproof. I want it in front of a prosecutor by the end of the week." And Celeste? He thought about what he wanted to say. He thought about the 8 months, about the medical office, about the 4 messages Alessandra had sent through an account Celeste had been accessing, about a woman who had calculated, from the beginning, that if she couldn't have what she wanted, she'd make sure no one else had it either. "Handle it the right way," he said. "The legal way." A pause that had weight in it. This time, he ended the call. He picked up the ring from the nightstand and held it in his closed fist and stood at the window, watching the gray November light come all the way up over the city, and somewhere out there in a room he didn't know, in a building he couldn't find, in a life she was already beginning to construct. Without him, Alessandra Vale was asleep, or trying to be, with her hand on her belly, and a decision made that no security footage, and no remorse, and no amount of Vescari power was going to unmake. He knew that. For the first time in his adult life, he was standing at the edge of something he could not cross by force, and the only direction available to him was the one that required him to become something he had never had much practice being. Patient, accountable, willing to wait for a chance he might never actually get. The ring was cold in his hand. He set it in the drawer of the nightstand and closed it. Then he went downstairs to begin the work of tearing apart everything Celeste Marrow had built piece by piece, starting with the pieces that had cost him the most. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough, but it was the only direction he had left. The apartment in Queens smelled like coffee and something baking bread, maybe, or something close to it, and for the first 3 days, that smell was the thing Alessandra held on to. Carmen's cousin was a woman named Rosa, somewhere in her 50s, with broad shoulders and a directness that Alessandra found more comforting than any amount of gentleness would have been. Rosa did not ask questions. She showed Alessandra the room clean, small, with a window that faced a brick wall and let in a rectangle of pale morning light, and she put fresh towels on the bed and said dinner was at 7 if she wanted it, and left her alone. Alessandra sat on the edge of the bed, and let herself breathe. The room was the smallest space she'd lived in since her early 20s, and it was the first place in 4 years where she felt like she could actually expand into the air around her without calculating the cost. She slept for 11 hours the first night. Real sleep, not the half-conscious monitoring she'd been doing for months in the Vescari mansion. Always some part of her brain listening for Ronan's car in the driveway, cataloging the hour, measuring the gap between when he said he'd be home and when he actually arrived. She woke up to the sound of Rose's television in the next room and the smell of that same bread and her daughter kicking her firmly in the ribs, which felt, in the circumstances, like a very reasonable thing to do. "I hear you," she said to her belly. "I'm working on it." On the fourth day, she called a lawyer, not a Vescari lawyer, not anyone connected to anyone she'd met in the past 4 years. She found the name through an organization. She'd looked up online a legal aid network that specialized in family law, funded independently, no institutional connections, to the kind of money that had connections to everything else. The lawyer's name was Patricia Owens, and she was 62 years old and had the voice of someone who had heard every version of every story and was not going to waste time being surprised by yours. Alessandra told her the facts, just the facts, in order, without editorializing. The marriage, the pregnancy, the gala, the slap, the departure. Patricia listened without interrupting, and then asked 5 specific questions about assets, documentation, and Ronan's business structure, and Alessandra answered all 5. "Okay," Patricia said when she was done. "Here's where we are." What followed was 20 minutes of clear, unadorned legal reality that Alessandra took notes on with a pen she'd borrowed from Rosa, writing in the margins of a grocery receipt, because she hadn't thought to bring a notepad. The divorce would be filed under her maiden name, Vale, which she had never legally relinquished. New York was an equitable distribution state, which meant the court divided assets fairly, not necessarily equally, and given the circumstances, a documented public incident, a pregnancy, a documented pattern of controlling behavior, she had a reasonable position. She was not required to accept anything from the Vescari estate. She was entitled to child support, regardless of what she accepted or didn't. "One thing I need to be direct with you about," Patricia said. "A man with his resources is going to have legal representation that makes this complicated. Not impossible. Complicated. Are you prepared for that?" "I'm prepared for a lot of things I wasn't prepared for a week ago," Alessandra said. Pause. "Fair enough." She filed the papers 4 days later through Patricia's office. By the time they reached Ronan, she was in her 3rd week in Queens, with a prenatal appointment scheduled at a clinic in a neighborhood where no one knew her last name, and a slowly developing plan for what came after the baby arrived. She did not know, yet, what Ronanzam was learning about Celeste. She did not know about Alberto's investigation, or the intercepted messages, or the 8 months of premeditation that was being assembled into a legal case in an office building in Lower Manhattan. She did not know that Ronan had sat in her empty closet and held her ring and understood too late the full architecture of what had been done to their marriage. She only knew what she'd lived, and what she'd lived was enough. Prenatal clinic was a 40-minute subway ride from Rose's apartment. Alessandra made it alone, which was fine. She had done most of the second half of this pregnancy essentially alone anyway, with Ronan present in body and somewhere else in every way that mattered. The midwife at the clinic was a young woman named Dr. Farron, who had careful hands and a matter-of-fact warmth, and who, when she reviewed Alessandra's records and noted the stress markers in her recent blood work, asked very directly whether Alessandra had a safe living situation. Alessandra said yes. Dr. Farron looked at her for a moment. "I'm going to ask you to say that again, but this time I want you to answer me, like I have time to hear the full truth." Alessandra looked back at her. Then she told her the full truth. Dr. Farron listened without expression, which was the clinical version of the same thing. Patricia Owens had done the professional stance of someone who needed to be useful, not reactive. When Alessandra finished, Dr. Farron wrote something in the chart and said, "Your blood pressure is elevated. Not in the danger range, But I want you monitoring it at home, and I want to see you every 10 days instead of every 3 weeks for the remainder of the pregnancy." She paused. Stress does real things to a body in this state. You're doing the right things. Just keep doing them. Alessandra nodded. She took the subway home in the November cold and sat in Rosa's kitchen and ate a bowl of soup and thought about the word safe. What made something safe? Whether safe was a place or a condition, or just the absence of certain specific threats. She was still thinking about it when Rosa sat down across from her with a cup of coffee and looked at her with the straightforward directness that was apparently a family characteristic. "The man's people have been to Carmen," Rosa said. Alessandra set down her spoon. "He sent someone to talk to her?" "He went himself." Rosa wrapped both hands around her mug. "Carmen called me. She said he didn't threaten her. Didn't ask for an address. Just wanted to know if you were safe." Rosa paused. Carmen told him yes. Didn't say anything else. Alessandra absorbed that. "He's not going to stay quiet about the baby," she said. "Not as a complaint, as a fact." "No," Rosa agreed. "He's not. I wasn't planning on keeping him from her." She pressed her palm against her stomach. "That was never what this was." Rosa nodded and didn't push further, which was one of the things Alessandra was most grateful for. That Rosa seemed to have an instinctive understanding of the difference between a woman who needed information and a woman who needed to think out loud and could identify which one was happening at any given moment. The divorce papers reached Ronan on a Tuesday. He was in the kitchen of the mansion when Alberto brought them in, not his study, not his office, but the kitchen, because he'd been sleeping badly and had been up since 5 and had made himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table the way ordinary men sat at kitchen tables, in the gray pre-dawn of a house that felt recently emptied. Alberto set the envelope on the table. Ronan looked at it for a moment. Then he opened it. He read the whole thing, front to back, slowly, without rushing. Patricia Owens was clearly competent. The filing was clean, the language precise, the requests reasonable. No punitive claim on Vescari assets beyond what the child's welfare required. No attempt to publicly expose his business entrance. Just the clear, legal end of a marriage, handled with the same controlled dignity with which Alessandra apparently handled everything once she'd made a decision. He set the papers down. "She filed under veil," he said. "Yes." Alberto stood near the doorway, hands clasped, keeping his distance. Ronan looked at the name on the papers, Alessandra Vale. Like the marriage had been a parenthesis in a life that had its own name, before and after. He didn't say anything else for a while. Alberto waited. "The Celeste file," Ronan said eventually. "Where are we?" Alberto exhaled slightly. "Prosecutor's office received everything yesterday. The financial fraud is straightforward, the account activity, the payments, the falsified records. Cyber access is more complex, but the forensic team is confident." He paused. "They're opening a formal investigation." "How long?" "Weeks, minimum. Months, realistically." Ronan nodded. "And Celeste herself? Where is she?" "Still in the city. Her attorney contacted our attorney this morning." Alberto's voice went carefully neutral. "She's suggesting a civil resolution. A settlement in exchange for her silence about certain business matters she claims to have documented." The kitchen went very quiet. Ronan picked up his coffee cup. Set it back down without drinking. "She's threatening me," he said. "She is, yes. While under investigation for fraud. She may not know yet how far along the investigation is." Alberto paused. "Or she does know, and she's moving fast, because she thinks she can get ahead of it." Ronan sat with that for a moment. This was the thing about Celeste Marrow, that he had spent 8 months not seeing clearly enough. She was not reckless. She was calculated. Everything she did had a logic to it, a cold, forward-looking logic that didn't include sentiment as a variable. She had planned his marriage's destruction 2 months before she'd even returned to New York. She had paid people who worked in his house and his wife's medical office. She had intercepted personal messages and manufactured evidence and choreographed a public moment with the precision of someone who had run the scenario in her head many times. A woman like that did not make a threat without a plan attached to it. "Find out what she claims to have," Ronan said. and find out if any of it is real. Alberto said he would. 3 hours later, Celeste Marrow walked into the lobby of a hotel in Midtown, and the man waiting for her there was not from Ronan's organization. He was from the prosecutor's office, and that was where everything that Celeste had carefully constructed began to come apart, not at the edges, but at the center, and all at once. Ronan heard about it from Alberto at noon. By 2 in the afternoon, Celeste's attorney had withdrawn the settlement demand. By 4, her primary holding company had frozen accounts while the fraud investigation expanded into 3 connected entities that Alberto's team had been tracking for the past week. Ronan sat in his study and listened to Alberto walk him through all of it. He felt very little that resembled satisfaction. What he felt instead was a persistent, grinding awareness that none of this, not Celeste's exposure, not her accounts freezing, not the investigation that would likely end in charges. None of it changed the fact of the divorce papers sitting on the kitchen table with Alessandra's maiden name on them. Boss, Alberto hesitated. There's something else. Ronan looked at him, the man at the medical office. The one who was passing Celeste information about Mrs. Vescari's appointments. Alberto held his pause a beat too long. We brought him in this morning. Informal conversation. Another pause. He confirmed what he passed, but he also told us something he wasn't paid to provide. What? Alberto reached into his jacket and took out a photograph. He set it on the desk face down, which was the move of a man who knew how the person across from him was going to react and was pre-managing the moment. Ronan turned it over. It was an ultrasound image, printed on standard clinical paper, the kind that came out of the machine at a prenatal appointment. The date on it was 6 weeks ago. In the corner, in small handwritten letters, a note from the sonographer that said clearly, unmistakably, it's a girl. Ronan stared at it. Celeste had this, he said. We believe so. She knew before I did. Alberto said nothing, which was its own answer. Ronan set the photograph down very gently. The particular quality of his stillness was something that the people who worked for him had learned to read carefully, not the angry stillness, not the calculating stillness, but a third kind. The kind that came when something landed in him that he did not yet know what to do with. She knew my daughter's gender, he said, before I did. Yes. He stood up slowly and walked to the window. His office faced south, toward the financial district, the glass towers, standing in the midday gray. He thought about Alessandra sitting in some clinic waiting room he'd never seen, in a neighborhood he didn't know, going to prenatal appointments alone because the marriage had deteriorated to the point where he hadn't been present enough to be asked, and someone in that clinic had been feeding that private, intimate information to a woman whose entire project had been the calculated destruction of everything Alessandra had. He thought about what it meant to have the details of your pregnancy, the most private physical facts of your body, and your child sold to someone who wanted to use them against you. And he thought about the 4 messages Alessandra had sent him through the intercepted account. The one where she'd said she suspected he had the photographs, where she'd tried to explain before the gala, before the moment that had ended the marriage. He had not received those messages, but the not receiving of them was not a passive event. Something had taken them. Someone had ensured they never arrived. And he had walked through 6 weeks of slow estrangement from his wife, believing she was pulling away, when she had, in fact, been reaching toward him in the only way she'd had available, and reaching toward silence. He turned around. Pull Celeste's phone records, he said. The full history. I want to know every number she contacted, starting from 8 months ago, already requested. And I want to know who else she had access to. Not just the people we've identified, everyone. Every person in my orbit and Alessandra's orbit who might have been approached. He paused. I need to know if there's anyone else. Alberto nodded. The phone records arrived the following morning, and what they contained opened a second investigation that neither Ronan nor Alberto had anticipated. Started with a number that appeared repeatedly in Celeste's call history over the preceding 4 months, always brief, always after 10 p.m., never longer than 3 minutes. Alberto ran it through the usual channels and came back 2 hours later with an expression Ronan hadn't seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who had found something that was going to require him to revise a fundamental assumption. "Whose number is it?" Ronan said. Alberto said a name. And the room went sideways. The name was Marco Ferrante. Gino Ferrante's younger brother. Gino Ferrante, who had been standing beside Ronan at the bar at the gala when Celeste arrived. Gino Ferrante, who had been with Ronan that night, and the night before, and half the nights in the preceding 6 weeks when Ronan had been out for business. Gino Ferrante, who had been with the Vescari organization for 9 years, and who Ronan had trusted with the kind of operational knowledge that required trust at the level of family. "Marco Ferrante," Ronan said. "He's had 12 contacts with Celeste's number over the past 4 months. Based on the timing and duration, Alberto the analyst cleared his throat based on the pattern. It appears they were coordinating something with a predictable structure. Regular check-ins, like reporting in. Ronan's jaw worked. "Pull Gino in," he said. "Today, boss, today, Alberto." Gino arrived at the house at 3 in the afternoon, which was fast enough that it told Ronan he was either innocent or had been expecting the call. He came in looking the way Gino always looked: big, solid, unhurried, with the squared-off posture of a man who had spent so many years working for someone powerful that he'd absorbed some of the gravity. He sat down across from Ronan in the study. Ronan laid the phone records on the desk between them, face up. Gino looked at them. He said nothing for 11 seconds, which Ronan counted. "Your brother," Ronan said, "and Celeste Marrow." Gino looked up. The thing about Gino Ferrante was that he had a good face for this, an impassive face, a face that had been shaped by years of situations where revealing what you were thinking was a mistake. He looked at Ronan now with that face and said, "I didn't know." "You didn't know. My brother doesn't report to me." "No," Ronan said. "He reports to me." He kept his voice level. "So when he's making regular contact with a woman who spent 8 months systematically destroying my family, and you're the person I trust to know what's happening in your own blood's life." He stopped. "Let it sit. Tell me what I'm supposed to conclude from that." Gino leaned forward. "Ronan, listen to me. Marco is 26 years old. He makes bad decisions. He meets women. I don't track my little brother's phone calls." His voice was urgent but controlled. "If he had contact with her, it was because she approached him. Not the other way. She would have seen him as an access point," Ronan said. "Yes." Gino's hands were flat on his thighs. "She would have seen every person close to you as an access point. And you didn't know." "I didn't know." Ronan looked at him for a long time. He was good at this, at reading people, at the specific skill of distinguishing between a man who was lying and a man who was telling the truth about a thing he was ashamed of, not knowing. He had been doing it for 20 years. It was one of the things that had kept him where he was. Gino was telling the truth about not knowing. But truth about not knowing was not the same as truth about everything. "Marco told Celeste about the night schedules," Ronan said. "The 2 weeks in October when I shipments moving through the Jersey operation. The nights I was genuinely out." He watched Gino's face. "Those nights lined up perfectly with the nights Celeste chose to be visible in my social circles, to be seen in places where word would get back to Alessandra." He paused. "Your brother gave her my schedule." Gino went very still. "He didn't know what it was for," he said. "Queer now." "That's possible," Ronan said. "It's also possible he knew exactly what it was for and decided the arrangement was worth it. He's my brother. He provided operational information about my schedule to a woman who was actively attempting to destroy my marriage and my family." Ronan's voice did not change, which was its own statement. "The relationship to you is not the relevant variable here." Gino sat back. He pressed both palms flat against his thighs and looked at the middle distance between them. "What do you want me to do?" he said. "I want you to bring him in," Ronan said. "And I want a full account. Every contact. Every piece of information. And I want to hear from him directly, whether it was ignorance or something else. And if it's something else." Ronan let the silence do what silence could do. Gino got up. He moved to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "She played everyone," he said. "Not just you. She played everyone in your life who had something she could use. He turned back to look at Ronan. That doesn't make it better. I know that. But you should understand what kind of person you're dealing with. I understand exactly what kind of person I'm dealing with, Ronan said. Gino left. Ronan sat alone in the study and looked at the phone records and the ultrasound photograph and the divorce papers that were still, for some reason, on the kitchen table rather than in a drawer. Because putting them in a drawer would be a kind of acknowledgement he wasn't fully prepared for. He picked up his phone and looked at it. He did not call Alessandra. He had promised his mother he would not make contact in a way that felt like pressure, and he understood the logic of that promise well enough to keep it even now, when every instinct he had. Instead, he called Patricia Owens's office and left a message with her assistant, identifying himself and asking, simply, that she communicate to her client that he did not intend to contest the divorce, and that child support arrangements could be made on whatever terms Patricia believed were fair. He ended the call. He sat with what he had done and what it cost him to do it. And he sat with the thing he had not yet allowed himself to name, the way the investigation into Celeste had not returned the marriage to him, the way exposing the manipulation did not undo the damage, the way truth arrived too late. Sometimes, to change the outcome it should have changed. He had understood the mechanism now, all of it. He could trace the architecture of what Celeste had built: the intercepted messages, the staged photographs, the paid informants, the gala, the calculated fall with the precision of a man dismantling a machine that had already fired. The machine had already fired, and Alessandra had not left because of Celeste. Alessandra had left because of him, because of the specific texture of his trust, which had been shallow enough that Celeste had been able to fill it with something else. Because of the distance he had allowed to build without addressing it. Because of one night when his temper had outrun every other part of him. Celeste had provided the conditions. He had provided the choice. And that distinction was the one thing, the only thing that Celeste's exposure could not resolve. His phone buzzed. Alberto. He picked up. Marco Ferrante is gone, Alberto said. Gino just called. He went to the apartment and Marco was packed out. Looks like he left within the last few hours. Ronan closed his eyes briefly. He knew we'd come. It looks that way. Yes. Which meant Marco had known, at some level, that what he'd been doing was not a thing that could be explained away as innocent contact. Which meant Gino, sitting across from Ronan an hour ago, with his hands flat on his thighs, had been telling the truth about not knowing, but had also been sitting across from Ronan, knowing that when he reached his brother would run, which was the same as knowing what his brother had done. Gino had chosen his blood, even now, even in this room. The oldest story in the world. Ronan set the phone down and pressed both palms flat on the desk and looked the surface of it, the grain of the wood, the edges of the paper stacked there. The orderly representation of a world he managed through force of will and long-established structures of loyalty. Those structures were cracking, not because of Celeste, who was a single point of failure now being systematically dismantled, but because of what she'd revealed: the gaps, the blind spots, the places where people he'd trusted had been reachable by someone with enough patience and enough calculation to find the price of every person near him. He thought of Alessandra in Rosa's apartment in Queens, without his name, with her daughter not yet born, with $11,000, and a lawyer and the particular strength of a woman who had to stop waiting for circumstances to improve. She had gotten out of the machine before it could do more damage. She had known, before he did, that the situation was more dangerous than it appeared. And she had walked out of the St. Regis ballroom with her hand on her stomach and her chin level, and had not looked back. And that act, which he had initially understood as anger, he now understood as something else entirely. It was clarity, the kind he was only arriving at now, weeks later, in a house that echoed with the evidence of everything he'd failed to see spread out on his desk. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go. Then something instinct, or the particular restlessness of a man with no useful action available to him, made him pick up. Mr. Vescari, a woman's voice. Controlled professional. My name is Dr. Farron. I'm a midwife at the Riverside Prenatal Clinic in Astoria. A pause. I'm calling because my patient has authorized me to make this contact, on the condition that I communicate only the medical information and nothing else. Ronan stood up. Is she all right, he said. The words came out before anything else. She's stable, Dr. Farin said. However, her blood pressure has elevated to a point that we're monitoring closely. This can be managed, but I want you to understand that her stress levels are a direct contributing factor, and I'm asking you as a medical professional, not as anyone's advocate, to consider carefully the nature of any contact you initiate with her in the coming weeks. He stood at the window, with the phone pressed hard against his ear. The baby, he said. The baby is healthy, Dr. Farin said. She's going to be a strong girl. A pause that was not quite professional. She's going to need a stable world to be born into. That's all I'll say about that. The call ended. Ronan stood at the window for a long time after. The city spread out below him, gray and enormous and indifferent, the way cities were, and somewhere in it, his daughter, who he now knew was a daughter. From an ultrasound photograph that Celeste had obtained before he did, was a month away from being born into a world he had spent 20 years building and one night helping to destroy. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. For the first time since the night of the gala, he felt something that was not anger, not strategy, not the grinding mechanical work of managing consequences. He felt the plain, unmanaged weight of what he had lost. And beneath that quieter and more frightening, because it required something of him that nothing in his life had ever required, the beginning of the understanding that the only path forward was the one that led away from everything he had relied on. Not power, not control, something he did not yet have a name for, in a language he was only just beginning to learn. Lucia Vescari-Vial was born on a Tuesday morning in December at 6:47 a.m. in a clinic in Astoria that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee and the particular industrial warmth of a building that ran its heating too high. She weighed 7 pounds, 2 ounces. She came out screaming, "Witch doctor," Farin said was a good sign, and which Alessandra, who had been in labor for 14 hours, was running on something well past exhaustion into a territory that didn't have a clean name, found deeply, specifically funny in a way she couldn't explain and didn't try to. Rosa was in the waiting room. That was who Alessandra had called not her mother, who lived in Connecticut and had a complicated relationship with her daughter's choices, and not any of the friends from her previous life who were too entangled in Vescari's social circles to be safely reached. Rosa, who had driven her to the clinic at 4 a.m. without complaint and had been sitting in a plastic chair in the waiting room for going on 3 hours. When Dr. Farin came out and told Rosa it was done, Rosa said good in the flat ways. She said most things, and then sat back down and folded her hands and waited to be told she could go in. Alessandra held Lucia for a long time before she let anyone else in the room. She held her and looked at her, at the scrunched, furious, perfect face, the dark hair, the hands that were disproportionately large and already moving with an uncoordinated determination that suggested she had opinions about the situation. "Hi," Alessandra said quietly. Lucia made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a complaint, and somehow managed to be both. "Yeah," Alessandra said. "I know." She did not cry, which surprised her. She had expected to cry. Instead, she felt something that settled, rather than broke open, a specific, groundwater kind of feeling, deep and without drama, the feeling of something true arriving after a long wait. Her daughter was here. Everything else was still true: the divorce, the money, the uncertain future, the blood pressure, that doctor. Farin was monitoring with the careful attention of someone who didn't like what she was seeing. All of it still true. But it was a different kind of true now, because Lucia was here, solid and warm and furiously alive, and that changed the geometry of everything. Ronan found out at 9 a.m. Marcelsa called him. She had known because Patricia Owens had been authorized by Alessandra to inform her a courtesy, and a controlled one, kind that said Alessandra had not decided to erase Lucia's paternal family from her life, but had also not decided to hand them any access they hadn't earned. Ronan picked up the phone on the second ring and listened to his mother say, "She's here. She's healthy. They're both fine." And then said nothing for long enough that Marcella said his name twice. "I'm here," he said. "I know." A pause. "Lucia." She named her Lucia. He had not known that. He hadn't known the name was coming, hadn't known it was the name he would have wanted if anyone had asked him, which no one had, because he had not been the kind of husband that got asked. He sat down on the stairs of the mansion, not in the study, not at the kitchen table on the stairs, like a man who had been walking somewhere and simply stopped. "Is there anything she needs?" he said. "She has what she needs." Marcella Ronan. His mother's voice was not unkind. It was the kind of precise that comes from someone who has thought carefully about what they're going to say. "You asked me not to interfere. I haven't interfered. What I'm telling you now is that your daughter exists. She is healthy, and her mother is managing. That's the information I was authorized to pass. A beat. The rest is yours to figure out." He ended the call. He sat on the stairs with his phone in his hand and thought about a girl he had never seen, named Lucia, born 14 stories and 4 zip codes away from where he was sitting, in a clinic he had never been to, with people he had never met. He sat there for a long time. Then he stood up and went to work, because it was the only thing he knew how to do, and because the alternative was sitting on those stairs until something broke in him that he wasn't sure he could put back together. The Celeste situation was moving faster now. The prosecutor's office had moved from investigation to formal charges in the preceding week: wire fraud, computer fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes, which was the legal framework for what Alberto's team had documented about the intercepted accounts and the paid operatives. Her attorney had filed 2 motions that were denied. Her primary holding company had been placed under receivership while the financial investigation continued. Celeste herself had gone quiet. That quiet was the thing that bothered Ronan more than the noise had. A woman who had planned everything 8 months in advance did not go quiet because she was beaten. She went quiet because she was planning the next thing. Alberto shared this concern. He said so on a Wednesday morning, standing in the study with his hands behind his back and his voice in the register he used for information that required careful delivery. "She's been meeting with someone," Alberto said. "Not her attorney. We've seen her twice at a restaurant in the West Village, with a man our people haven't been able to fully identify. He pays cash. No phone visible, not press," Ronan said. "We don't think so. His body language is wrong for press." Press leans in. This man waits for her to come to him. What kind of man waits for a woman who needs something? Alberto looked at him. The kind who has something she needs. Ronan thought about that. Keep watching. There's something else. Alberto reached into his jacket and produced a photograph, physical, printed, the kind Alberto preferred when the content was sensitive, no digital trail. He set it on the desk. It was Gino Ferrante. Standing outside a building, Ronan recognized a building in the Flatiron district that housed offices of 3 shell companies connected to a family from Philadelphia that Ronan had been in careful territorial negotiation with for 2 years. "When was this?" Ronan said. 3 days ago. He went to them. Here so. Ronan did not move for a moment. He looked at the photograph with the same quality of stillness he'd had in the kitchen, in the closet, on the stairs, the stillness of a man absorbing information that required him to revise something fundamental. Gino Ferrante had been with the Vescari organization for 9 years. He had sat across from Ronan in this study 2 weeks ago and said, "I didn't know," with the face of a man telling the truth. And then his brother had run, and Gino had let him, and now Gino was standing outside a building in the Flatiron district making contact with a family that had been looking for leverage against the Vescari operation for 2 years. "He's making a move," Ronan said. "That's what it looks like. While I'm dealing with Celeste." "Yes." He picked up the photograph and looked at it. This was the thing that Celeste had set in motion, not just the marriage, not just the personal destruction, but the signal to everyone watching that Ronan Vescari was distracted, destabilized, dealing with something public and personal and visible. In the world he operated in, distraction was the same as weakness, and weakness was an invitation. She had known that. Of course she had known that. She had been inside this world long enough to understand how it worked. Long enough to know that if she could make the marriage collapse publicly, the reverberations would reach further than the mansion. He had underestimated her. He would not do it again. "I need to talk to Gino," he said. "I'd recommend not doing it here," Alberto said. "If he's already made contact with the Philadelphia people, this house may not be the right environment for that conversation. Then pick a different environment." The meeting happened that afternoon in a warehouse in Red Hook that Ronan used for logistics, not criminal logistics. Legitimate logistics, the kind that came with his construction and development businesses, that involved actual equipment and actual workers and actual paperwork. The kind of space that had cameras and loading doors and the natural authority of a place that belonged to him. Gino arrived at 3. He walked in the way he always walked, solid, squared off, unhurried, and then he saw Ronan standing in the center of the space, and he stopped. Ronan let him stand there for a moment. "Close the door," he said. Gino closed it. "Sit down." There were 2 chairs in the middle of the warehouse floor, folding chairs, deliberately undramatic, the choice of a man who wanted the conversation to be about the conversation, not the staging. Gino sat. Ronan stayed standing. "Flatiron," Ronan said. Gino's jaw worked. "You want to tell me about it," Ronan said. "Or you want me to tell you what I already know, and then we can figure out what's left to say." Gino looked at him. His face was doing something complicated, not guilt, exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it. Something that looked more like a man who had made a decision he believed was justified and was now sitting across from the person that decision was made against. "They came to me," Gino said. "The Philadelphia people." "Yes," after Marco ran. "Yes." Gino's voice was level, but his hands were gripped together between his knees, with the particular tension of a man holding himself in place. "They told me they had information about Celeste and Marco. They said Marco had been working with Celeste to feed them information too, not just about your schedule, not just about the household, about the operation, distribution routes, warehouse locations." Ronan went very still. "Marco was feeding the Philadelphia organization through Celeste," Gino said. "That's what they told me, and you believe them. I went to verify it, by walking into their office, by meeting with someone who had documentation." Gino's voice tightened. "I didn't go there to make a deal, Ronan. I went there because my brother apparently spent 6 months passing operational intelligence to people who want to take everything you've built, and I needed to know how much damage was done. And you didn't come to me first." The silence between them had a specific quality, the quality of a 9-year relationship, discovering a crack it hadn't known was there. "I wasn't sure," Gino said, "what you would do to my brother if I came to you first. So you decided to handle it yourself. I decided to understand it first." "That's different." "It's not, actually." Ronan pulled the other chair out and sat down in it, close, the kind of close that was deliberate. "When you decide to go outside this organization, to understand something about this organization, you've already made the move. Whether you meant it that way or not." Gino looked at him directly. "Marco is my brother, and this is your organization. Those 2 things needed to be in order. You knew what order they needed to be in when you signed on 9 years ago. I know what I signed on to." Gino's voice cracked just slightly at the edge of one word and then smoothed back out. "But that was before my little brother was 26 and stupid, and apparently being run by a woman who was playing a 20-person chess game while we were all standing around, thinking she was just heartbroken." The warehouse was very quiet. Outside, faintly, the sound of the docks, a crane, water, the low percussion of industry. "Where is Marco?" Ronan said. "I don't know." "Gino." "I genuinely don't know. He's not answering. He knows I'd have to tell you if I found him." Gino pressed his clasped hands against his mouth for a moment. A gesture that was not theatrical. It was the actual gesture of a man trying to hold something in. "He's 26. He was flattered by her. He's not a soldier. He works loading docks. He did paperwork work for your father's operation. 15 years ago, he's not. He didn't understand what he was in the middle of. He understood enough to run." "Yes." Gino dropped his hands. "He did." Ronan looked at the man across from him. looked at him with the full attention of 20 years, of reading people in rooms very much like this one. Looked at him until the air between them had a weight to it. The documentation, Ronan said. What the Philadelphia people showed you. How much did they have? Gino reached into his coat. He pulled out a folded envelope and set it on the floor between the two chairs. Ronan picked it up, opened it, looked at the papers inside. For 30 seconds he read without expression. Then he set it back in the envelope and set the envelope on his knee. This is real, he said. It wasn't a question. I had it verified. By who? Someone I trust who isn't in this room and isn't in your organization. Gino looked at him steadily. Because those were the only people available to me who had the technical knowledge and no stake in the outcome. You went outside the organization twice. Yes. And you're telling me this now because I'm not Celeste. Gino's voice hardened at the edges, not with anger, but with something more specific conviction, maybe, or the particular kind of dignity that a man reaches for when he's trying to show he hasn't crossed the line he's standing near. I'm not Marco. I don't disappear. I sit in a chair across from you, and I tell you the truth even when the truth makes me look bad, because that's what 9 years means. Ronan said nothing. Fire me if that's what this is, Gino said. Do what you have to do, but you need to know what's in that envelope. The envelope contained 3 things. A record of operational communications that had been passed from Marco Ferrante to Celeste Marrow to a contact within the Philadelphia organization. A financial trace showing 3 payments made from an account connected to that organization to an account connected to Marco. And a series of dates that corresponded with a precision that made Ronan's chest tighten to specific operational windows in the preceding 6 months. Windows during which decisions had been made, routes had been changed, and 2 minor but significant complications had arisen that Ronan had attributed to the ordinary friction of doing business. They were not ordinary friction. They were responses to information that had been provided in advance. Ronan set the envelope on the floor. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. He thought about Celeste in a restaurant in the West Village with a man who paid cash and waited for her to come to him. He thought about the formal charges that had been filed and the accounts that had been frozen and the attorney's motions that had been denied. And he thought about the particular logic of a woman who had been calculating 8 months ahead of everyone around her. She was not done. The charges were not an ending for her. They were a variable she had anticipated and built around. She gave the Philadelphia people the operational information, Ronan said slowly. Not as a courtesy, as a price. Gino looked at him. A price for what? Ronan stood up. He moved to the loading door and pushed it open a foot, letting in the cold salt air off the water. He stood there, looking at the gray December sky, and the concrete dock, and the crane working somewhere to the left, and he put it together the way he put things together, not fast, but completely. She's been building a second exit, he said. While the investigation was running, while the accounts were freezing, while she was sitting across from her attorney filing motions she knew wouldn't work, she was negotiating with the Philadelphia family. Using operational intelligence about my business as the currency, he turned around. If she can hand them enough leverage over my operation to make me agree to a settlement, the charges become a bargaining chip. She drops cooperation with the investigation in exchange for my people backing off. Gino stared at him. She's going to use my own operation to threaten me, Ronan said. Into settling the case, into making it go away. Can she do that? She can try. He walked back to the chair. She needs one more delivery. One more piece that's significant enough to give them real leverage, not just historical data. He picked up the envelope. What's in here is months old. It's useful, but it's not current. To make a move like this work, she needs something current. Marco doesn't have anything current, Gino said. He's been gone for 2 weeks. No. Ronan looked at him. But whoever Celeste has been meeting in the West Village might. Gino's expression changed. You already have someone watching her. I've had someone watching her for 3 weeks. Then you already know who she's meeting. I know what he looks like. I'm still working on who he is. Ronan set the envelope down. But if she's planning a second delivery, it happens soon. The investigation is moving. She doesn't have time for another 8 months. He picked up his phone and called Alberto. The West Village man, he said when Alberto answered. I need an identity today. We're close, Alberto said. Today, Alberto. He ended the call. Gino was watching him. What do you need from me? Gino said. Ronan looked at him for a long moment at the man across from him, who had gone outside the organization and come back and sat in a folding chair and told the truth about it, which was not nothing. Which was, in fact, the thing that mattered most. I need you to stay, Ronan said. And I need you to understand that when this is over, we're going to have a longer conversation about what happened, about what you did and why. And that conversation isn't going to be comfortable. I know. But right now I need you in your position because I'm about to have one of the worst 48 hours I've had in a decade, and I cannot afford gaps. Gino nodded. One solid movement, no performance. He stood up. He picked up his chair and folded it and leaned it against the wall the way you handled someone else's equipment carefully. And then he walked to the door. Ronan. He stopped with his hand on the frame. Whatever she's planning. She's not going to stop because she's scared. She's going to stop because something more important to her is at stake. He paused. Figure out what that is. He left. Ronan stood alone in the warehouse. The loading door was still open a foot. Cold air moved through it, in slow pulses like the building was breathing. He thought about what Gino had said, something more important to her. He thought about 8 months of planning. He thought about the methodical placement of operatives, the intercepted messages, the staged photographs, the gala. He thought about a woman who had returned to New York. He thought about a woman who had returned to New York, not because she'd heard Ronan was unhappy, or because the timing was right, but because she had decided to return and then built the conditions for returning around herself. That kind of planning was not about love. It was not even about Ronan. It was about something she needed, that she had decided she could only get this way. He needed to know what that was. Alberto called back at 6 p.m. The West Village man, he said. His name is Dario Santini. He's a financial attaché for the Ricci family out of Naples. Ronan's hand tightened on the phone. The Ricci family was not Philadelphia. The Ricci family was something considerably older and considerably farther reaching than the Philadelphia organization. And the idea that Celeste was sitting in West Village restaurants with a financial attaché from Naples meant that the architecture of what she was building was not a domestic problem. She's not making a deal with Philadelphia, Ronan said. No, Alberto said. We think she's using the Philadelphia connection as a demonstration of capacity, to show the Ricci people she has something real. A pause. They've been trying to establish a foothold in the Northeast for 2 years. They'd want someone with inside knowledge of the existing organization. And Celeste is positioning herself as that person. That's what it looks like. Ronan closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them, his mind was very clear in the specific way it got clear when the situation had become serious enough to strip everything else away. She's not trying to settle the legal case, he said. That was a distraction. She's trying to sell her way into a position with the Ricci family using what she knows about my operation. He paused. The charges, the investigation, she thinks she can outrun them if she has the Ricci family's backing. That's our read, Alberto said. How long do we have? Santini is booked on a flight back to Naples in 4 days. 4 days. Whatever Celeste was delivering to make herself valuable enough for that backing, she had 4 days to deliver it. I want her movements from now until that flight, Ronan said. Everything. And I want to know if she makes contact with anyone in our current network. Already on it, he ended the call. He stood in the warehouse in the December cold and understood that the problem in front of him had just changed shape entirely. It was no longer the contained problem of a woman who had destroyed his marriage and was facing legal consequences. It was something much larger and much older and much more dangerous than a divorce and a fraud charge. And the only way to stop it required him to move in the next 96 hours with the kind of precision that left no margin. He drove back to the city. He drove himself, which he rarely did, no driver, no escort, just Ronan Vescari and the FDR Drive and Manhattan skyline coming up in the passenger window, winter gray and enormous. His phone buzzed. Not Alberto, not Marcella. A number he didn't recognize. And then he did recognize it, the clinic in Astoria, Dr. Farron's direct line. He picked up. Mr. Vescari. Her voice had the quality of 3 in the morning even though it was 6 p.m. I'm calling because your daughter's mother asked me to. She didn't want to call you directly, but she didn't want you to hear this from someone else. His stomach dropped. What happened? Alessandra's blood pressure spiked this afternoon. She's stable now. She's being monitored overnight. A pause that had weight in it. She's asking, and I want to be clear this is her asking. Not me, she's asking if you can come. Not to the room, to the building. She said you'd understand what that meant. He understood. It meant close enough to be reached, not close enough to be a presence she hadn't chosen. It meant she was scared enough to ask for something. From him. He pressed his palm flat against the steering wheel. Tell her I'm on my way, he said. He drove. The clinic in Astoria was exactly the kind of building he'd imagined functional, clean, nothing like the facilities he could have paid for, nothing like the world he'd spent 20 years building. The waiting room had plastic chairs and a television mounted too high on the wall and a smells of recycled air and floor cleaner. He sat in one of those plastic chairs. He did not touch his phone. He did not call Alberto, did not check the surveillance updates, did not think about Celeste Marrow or Dario Santini or the 4 days he had left to stop something that had been building for 8 months. He sat. He sat the way he had sat on the stairs of the mansion, like a man who had been walking somewhere and simply stopped, but this time without the phone in his hand and without the weight of what he couldn't fix. Because in this waiting room, there was nothing to fix. There was only the waiting. And the particular terrible quality of waiting for information about someone you had hurt and could not unhurt. An hour passed. Dr. Farron came out. She looked at him with the measured expression of a professional who had decided, somewhere, to neither like nor dislike him until she had more information. She's stable, she said. Blood pressure is coming down. The baby is fine. She paused. She's asking if you're here. Tell her yes. Dr. Farron looked at him for a moment. She said to tell you. She stopped. Seemed to be choosing her words. She said to tell you that this is not an opening. She said you'd need to hear that. He nodded. She also said another pause. She said thank you for coming. He sat in that plastic chair for 3 more hours. He sat until the night staff changed, and the waiting room emptied, and the television cycled through 3 different programs he couldn't focus on. And he sat with the understanding of what it meant that she had asked him to come at all, and what it meant that she had needed to specify that it wasn't an opening. She was protecting herself, still. Even from a hospital bed with elevated blood pressure and a newborn daughter, she was drawing the line clearly, holding it cleanly. He respected that. More than respected it, he felt the specific, unfamiliar weight of learning something about a person you thought you knew from the evidence of how they behaved at their most vulnerable, and finding that what you learned made them more, not less, than what you'd believed. At 10 p.m., Dr. Farron came back out. She's sleeping, she said. You should go home. He stood. Is there anything she needs, he said. Medically, financially, anything. Dr. Farron looked at him steadily. What she needs right now is rest and low stress. He nodded. He walked out of the clinic into the December cold and in Astoria with his hands in his coat pockets and his breath making small clouds in the air. And he thought about the 96 hours in front of him and the thing he had to do inside them to stop Celeste from completing what she'd started. And he thought about Lucia, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, named by a woman who had made all the hard choices alone, sleeping 1 floor above him in a building that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. He thought about all the things that were happening simultaneously in his life in the specific way. They were all connected. Celeste and the Ritchie family and Gino and Marco and the divorce papers on his kitchen table and the ring in the nightstand drawer and the girl in the waiting room photograph that Marcella had shown him weeks ago, holding a baby he hadn't known yet. He thought about what Gino had said, figure out what's more important to her. And standing on the sidewalk in the cold, it arrived not as a revelation, not as something dramatic. but as the quiet, logical conclusion of everything he now knew about Celeste Marrow and how she operated and what she had done and why. She had never been doing any of this for love. She had been using the appearance of love as the mechanism. The Ricci family connection was not a fallback. It was the original destination. Everything else the marriage, the gala, the fraud charges had always been the means, not the end. Which meant the one thing that could stop her was not legal action. It was removing what she was selling. Before Santini got on his plane, he pulled out his phone and called Alberto. "I know what she's selling," he said. "And I know how to make it worthless." A pause. "Get everyone in. Tonight." Alberto said nothing for 1 second then. "I'll make the calls." Ronan looked up at the second-floor window of the clinic, dark, curtained, giving away nothing. "One more thing," he said. "Whatever happens in the next 4 days, no one comes near this building. No one from our side, no one from any other side. You understand me?" "Understood. She's off the board," he said. "Completely. Whatever it costs." He ended the call. He stood on the sidewalk one more moment. Then he turned and walked toward his car. And behind him, the clinic held its warmth against the December cold. And inside it, his daughter slept in the particular safety of a woman who had drawn the line and held it. And around him, the city ran its enormous, indifferent machinery. And 4 days from now, everything that Celeste Marrow had built was either going to collapse or it was going to cost him the last thing he had left to lose. And Ronan Vescari walked toward his car, understanding both of those facts, with complete clarity and choosing, for the first time in his life, to move forward without the certainty of which one it was going to be. The meeting happened at 2 a.m. in a building in Red Hook that had no sign on the door and no record in any database that connected it to the Vescari name. 7 men in that room. Alberto. 2 attorneys, 1 criminal, 1 civil. A forensic accountant named Shen, who had worked with federal investigators for 12 years, going private, and who carried himself with the particular contained energy of someone who was very good at finding things people had tried to hide. And 2 men from Ronan's legitimate operations, whose names would mean nothing to anyone outside the industry, but whose institutional knowledge of the development and logistics businesses Ronan had spent a decade building were essential to what he was about to do. Ronan stood at the head of a table that had blueprints and financial records and printed phone logs spread across it, and he explained what he understood about what Celeste was selling to the Ricci family, and what had to happen in the next 92 hours to make it worthless. The room listened. When he finished, the criminal attorney, a woman named Hadley, who wore no jewelry and had the fastest legal mind Ronan had encountered in 20 years of needing fast legal minds, said, "What you're describing is a voluntary disclosure to federal authorities of certain operational structures that you've been maintaining in a gray area for the past several years." "Yes," Ronan said. "You understand that disclosure is not consequence-free." "I understand. You're going to take a significant financial hit. Certain structures will have to be dissolved. There will be scrutiny." "I know what it costs," Ronan said. "Tell me if it's viable." Hadley looked at her notes, looked at Shen. Some kind of rapid professional communication happened between them that didn't require words. "If you move in the next 48 hours, she said, before Santini has whatever Celeste is preparing to hand him, yes, it's viable. You get ahead of it. You control the narrative of the disclosure. What she delivers to him becomes information the authorities already have, which makes it worthless as leverage and potentially incriminating for her as evidence of conspiracy with a foreign organized crime structure. Which adds to the existing charges," Alberto said. Significantly, Hadley confirmed. Ronan looked at the table, at the blueprints and the records and the phone logs. Physical evidence of 2 decades of building something in the particular way that men like him built things, not entirely in the light, not entirely in the dark. In the gray space between that required constant management and constant vigilance, and the kind of relationships that couldn't be put on paper. He was about to put a lot of it on paper. "Do it," he said. Hadley and Shen left within the hour to begin the process that would take 48 hours of continuous work to complete. Alberto stayed, When the room was just the two of them, Alberto poured 2 glasses of water from a bottle on the side table and set one in front of Ronan and sat down and said nothing for a moment. You know what this changes, Alberto said. Everything on the operational side. Everything, Alberto repeated. Not just the gray areas. The whole structure shifts. The relationships that depend on those structures. I know. Some of those men have been with your family for 20 years. I know that too. Alberto looked at his water glass. Is this about stopping Celeste, or is it about something else? Ronan thought about a plastic chair in a waiting room in Astoria. About a note on the back of a photograph. She will never grow up believing fear is love. Both, he said. At this point, I think it's both. Alberto nodded slowly. He was not a man who editorialized. He had worked for Ronan for 11 years, and in that time had delivered difficult information, managed difficult situations, and maintained his own counsel about the moral dimensions of what he was part of with the professional discipline of someone who had decided, long ago, where his line was and kept to it. Then I'll support it, he said, whatever you need. They worked through the night, 40 miles away, in a room above the West Village restaurant where she'd been meeting Dario Santini. Celeste Marrow sat at a desk in the dark with a laptop open and a glass of wine she hadn't touched, and the particular focused attention of a person running the final calculations on something they've spent a long time building. She knew about the investigation. She knew about the frozen accounts and the formal charges and the denied motions. Her attorney had been clear that the legal path was narrowing. But Celeste had never relied on one path. She had learned, early and thoroughly, that the women who survived in the world she moved through were the women who had always built the next door before the current one closed. Santini had told her what the Ritchie family needed. She had what they needed. The operational intelligence she'd assembled, through Marco, through the household staff, through the months of careful listening in rooms where she was underestimated. It was enough. Not everything, but enough to establish her value, and value, in her experience, was the only currency that held. She had 2 days. She opened the file on her laptop and began preparing the final document. She did not know about Hadley and Shen working through the night in Red Hook. She did not know that the operational structures she was about to expose were being voluntarily disclosed to federal authorities in a process that, by the time she handed anything to Santini, would render her information not only worthless, but legally dangerous. She thought she had built an exit. She had actually built a room with no windows. The voluntary disclosure was filed at 11 a.m. on a Thursday 47 hours after the meeting in Red Hook. Hadley called Ronan when it was done. It's filed, she said. They'll want to talk to you directly. I'd expect a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office within 24 hours. I'll be available. Ronan. A pause that had a different quality to it, not the attorney, but the person underneath her. This was the right thing to do, for what it's worth. He didn't say anything for a moment. It's worth something, he said. I'm not sure what yet. He ended the call and sat in his study and looked at the room around him. The room that had the desk and the bookshelves and the chair where Gino had sat 2 weeks ago, with his hands clasped between his knees and told the truth about a hard thing. The room that had the window looking south toward the financial district, where the glass towers stood in the winter light, doing their ordinary work of being enormous. Called his mother. Marcella answered on the second ring. Done, he said. A pause. All of it, she said. Enough of it. Another pause. How much did it cost? A lot. He leaned back in the chair. The development businesses are clean. The logistics are mostly clean. The rest is... He stopped. The rest is going to look different going forward. Marcella was quiet for a moment. Your father, she said, would have said you'd lost your mind. Yes. I think you found it. She said it, without softness, not as a compliment, exactly, but as observation from someone who had been watching a long time. What happens now? Now we wait to see if Celeste makes the delivery. And if she does, then she delivers information that federal authorities already have to a foreign organized crime contact, which substantially compounds her existing charges. He paused. And if she doesn't, if she somehow finds out in time, then the Ritchie family loses interest in her because she can't deliver, and she faces the existing charges without the backing she was counting on. Either way, Marcella said. Either way, he confirmed. He heard her exhale. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated. And Alessandra, she said. She's out of it. Completely. He looked at the window. Whatever comes out of the legal process, whatever scrutiny lands on the Vescari name, in the next year she's Vale. She's not connected. I made sure of that. Marcella said nothing for a moment. You protected her, she said. I should have protected her from the beginning. He said it without self-pity. Just the flat accounting of a man who had learned to look at his own record clearly. This is what I can do now. Celeste made the delivery on Friday morning. She met Santini in the lobby of his hotel with a USB drive and a document package, and the practiced confidence of a woman completing a transaction she'd been working toward for months. She handed it over. Santini thanked her. They shook hands. 3 hours later, Santini was detained at JFK by federal agents. The USB drive was logged into evidence. By Friday evening, Celeste Merrow's attorney had received notice that the existing charges against her had been expanded to include conspiracy with a foreign criminal organization, and that a second federal agency was now involved in the investigation. Celeste sat in her apartment in the West Village with her attorney on the phone and looked at the wall. She did not call Ronan. She had enough self-knowledge to understand that whatever she might have said would not have changed anything and would have been used against her, in court or otherwise. She sat with it. Ronan found out from Hadley at 7 p.m. on Friday. He was in the kitchen of the mansion when the call came. The same kitchen, the same table, the same coffee cup. He listened. He thanked her. He ended the call. He sat for a while. He did not feel the satisfaction he would once have felt. He felt tired, mostly the specific tiredness of someone who has been in a sustained crisis for weeks and is now in the moment just after the peak, where the adrenaline drains and what's left is the plain weight of what the whole thing cost. Celeste would face charges that would likely end her in the world she'd operated in. The operational restructuring he'd initiated would change the Vescari organization, fundamentally less powerful in certain ways, more legitimate in others, smaller in the short term, survivable in the long term. The scrutiny would be uncomfortable. Some relationships would not survive it. None of that felt like winning. It felt like a bill, paid late, for a debt that had been accumulating for a long time. He poured the coffee down the sink and went to bed. Lucia was 6 weeks old when Ronan first held her. It happened in a park in Astoria, not the public garden the outline of his life had imagined, but a small neighborhood park with a rusted swing set and 2 benches and a concrete path that needed repaving, which was the kind of park that existed in actual neighborhoods where actual people lived. Alessandra had arranged it through Patricia Owens, which was the appropriate channel. The terms had been established in writing. 1 hour. Public location. No photographers, no staff, no one from the Vescari operation within 2 blocks. Ronan arrived on foot, which he hadn't done in years, walked from the subway like a person, through the neighborhood, past the bodega and the dry cleaner and the restaurant, with the handwritten menu in the window. He wore a coat he'd had for years, nothing conspicuous. He had his hands in his pockets. Alessandra was already on the bench when he arrived. She was wearing a dark coat and her hair was different from the last time he'd seen her, shorter or differently arranged, something he couldn't quite identify that made her look like a version of her Telfs he was only now getting to see. The version that wasn't performing anything for anyone. She had Lucia in her arms. Lucia was wearing a yellow hat that was slightly too large for her and was occupied with great seriousness with the work of looking at the sky. Ronan stopped a few feet from the bench. Alessandra looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "She's been good this morning," Alessandra said. Her voice was level, not warm, not cold. The voice of someone who had decided to manage this situation with the same controlled competence she brought to everything. She looked stopped, started again. "She's beautiful." "Yes." Alessandra looked down at Lucia. Something moved across her face that she didn't try to manage love, the specific unguarded kind. She has opinions already, very clear opinions about things. Does she? About what time she prefers to eat, About which position she sleeps in. About the hat. Alessandra glanced at the yellow hat. She doesn't like the hat, but it's December. Ronan looked at his daughter. Can I? He stopped. He didn't know how to ask. Alessandra shifted Lucia slightly and held her out toward him. He sat on the bench, leaving space between himself and Alessandra, careful with the distance, and he took his daughter. He'd held babies before, Gino's kids, the children of people who worked for him. He knew the physical mechanics, the support under the head, the distribution of weight. He knew it intellectually, but Lucia turned and looked at him, in the particular unfocused way of a 6-week-old who is registering a new thing, and whatever he knew, intellectually, became irrelevant in the face of the fact of her. He sat very still. "Hi," he said, quietly, the way Alessandra had said it in the delivery room, the word that arrived before any other word, because there was nothing more accurate. Lucia made a sound. He felt it in his chest, like a physical impact. He sat on that cold bench in that small park in Astoria, and held his daughter and did not speak, and beside him, Alessandra did not speak either. And the silence between them was not the silence of the mansion, or the silence of the gala, or the silence of the empty closet. It was a different kind, the silence of two people who had been through something irreversible and had arrived at a place, on the other side of it, where speaking required more honesty than either of them could fully manage yet. After a while, Ronan said, without looking up from Lucia, "I filed a voluntary disclosure with the federal authorities." Alessandra said nothing. Some of the operational structures. The ones that were the gray areas. He paused. It's going to change things considerably. The name is going to be in some uncomfortable places for a while. You did that before or after Celeste? Before. It's what made her delivery worthless. Silence. "Why are you telling me this?" Alessandra said. He thought about it honestly. "Because you deserve to know that the world your daughter is going to be associated with, on the paternal side, is going to look different in 5 years than it does now. Not perfect, not clean, but different." He paused. "And because you made a decision about what kind of world she'd grow up in, and I think you should know I heard it." Alessandra looked at the concrete path in front of them. "Hearing it and doing something about it are different things," she said. "I know. And doing something about it because you want to get your wife back is different from doing it because it's right. I know that too." He finally looked at her. "I don't expect you to take it as anything other than what it is. I'm not asking for anything." He looked back at Lucia. "I just wanted you to know." Alessandra was quiet for a long time. A woman walked by with a stroller, not looking at them. Pigeons reorganized themselves on the concrete path. Somewhere nearby, a truck made a reversing sound, loud and ordinary. "Carmen called me," Alessandra said eventually. "I didn't ask her to." "I know, she called on her own." A pause. "She said you've been different." Ronan didn't respond. "She said you've been sitting in the kitchen in the mornings." "She said you've been—" Alessandra stopped. "She said you seem like someone trying to figure out how to be in a place instead of just occupying it." He thought about that. "That's a good way to put it," he said. "She's known you since you were 12 years old." 13. Alessandra looked at him. And for the first time, not warmly, not with forgiveness, not with anything that could be mistaken for what had existed between them, before she looked at him like a person rather than a problem she was managing. Just a person, complicated and damaged and trying, in the late and imperfect way that people tried when they'd run out of better options. "I'm not coming back," she said quietly, but not unkindly. "I need you to understand that completely. Not as a position I'm holding because I'm angry. The fact, I understand it. The divorce is going to be final in March. Patricia is handling the rest. I don't want anything from the estate beyond what's appropriate for Lucisa. Patricia has my full cooperation. Whatever she asks for is agreed." Alessandra nodded. "I'm going to open a studio," she said. Then, as if she hadn't intended to say it, or wasn't sure why she had, "Interior design. There's a space in Long Island City. I've been talking to a partner, a woman I knew before." A pause. "I'm telling you because Lucia is going to grow up watching her mother work, and I want that to be the world she knows. I don't want her to know the other version." "She won't," he said. "Not from me. Alessandra looked at him one more time. Then she looked at Lucia, still in his arms, still occupied with the serious work of existing, and something softened in her face not for him, but for the thing she was seeing, which was her daughter held carefully by a man who was holding her like she might dissolve if he moved wrong. She likes to be held facing out, Alessandra said, so she can see things. He adjusted his hold carefully. Lucia immediately seemed more satisfied with the arrangement. There it is, Alessandra said softly. The hour passed. When it was over, Alessandra took Lucia back with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this every day for 6, and she stood and adjusted Lucia against her shoulder and looked at Ronan. Same time in 2 weeks, she said. I'll be here. On foot, no car, no staff. On foot, no staff, she nodded. She turned and walked back toward the street. She didn't look back, which was not a statement about Ronan. It was just how she moved through the world. She decided which direction she was going, and she went there. He watched her until she turned the corner and was gone. Then he sat on the bench in the small park with the rusted swing set and the concrete path that needed repaving and put his hands on his knees and sat with everything that was true. The divorce would be final in March. Lucia would be 4 months old. He would be a man who showed up on foot, without staff, every 2 weeks, and held his daughter for an hour in a public park, and that would be the extent of what he had. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, the only thing that hadn't been burned away by the preceding months, the only thing that was going to grow rather than diminish if he handled it with the care it deserved. He understood that. Time moved. Spring came. The studio in Long Island City opened on a Tuesday in April, with a small gathering of people Alessandra had curated carefully. Her partner, whose name was Diane, and who was brisk and funny, and had a talent for structural space that complemented Alessandra's talent for surface and atmosphere. Patricia Owens, who had become something closer to a friend than a lawyer over the preceding months. Rosa and Carmen, both of whom arrived together and stood near the food and watched everything with the satisfaction of people who had been present at the beginning of a difficult story and were glad to see where it had gotten to. Dr. Farron, who came because Alessandra had asked and because she believed, as a professional matter, that the things women built on the other side of hard experiences deserved witnessing. Ronan was not there. He had not been invited, which was appropriate. Marcella was, which Alessandra had arranged herself a phone call, carefully worded, in which she had said simply that Lucia's grandmother was welcome if she wanted to come. Marcella had arrived first, before anyone else, and had stood in the empty studio looking at what Alessandra had built and had not cried, because Marcella Vescari did not cry at things. But she had pressed her hand briefly against the doorframe when she thought no one was looking. The gesture of a woman touching something she was grateful still existed. The studio was good. It was genuinely, concretely good, the kind of work that looked like the person who made it, specific and considered and without pretension. The opening got written up in 2 trade publications, and one general interest design magazine had started covering the Long Island City Creative District. Alessandra saw the second trade publication on her phone while she was nursing Lucia at 2 in the morning, sitting in the rocking chair. She'd gotten second-hand from a woman on the floor above Rose's and refinished herself over the course of 3 evenings with sandpaper and a stain that was exactly the right shade of amber. She looked at the photograph of her own studio in the magazine and felt something very simple. She felt like herself, not the version of herself that had stood in a $4,500 dress in the St. Regis ballroom calculating how to be present in a room where she was essentially alone. Not the version that had picked up the pieces of a marriage that had been cracked from the beginning and tried to hold them together through sheer careful management. Not the version that had packed a suitcase at 2 in the morning with shaking hands and driven away from a life that had never quite fit. Just herself, the person she'd been before, and the person she'd become, and the version of those 2 things that had come out the other side. She looked down at Lucia, who was asleep now, milk-drunk and utterly relaxed, one small hand curled against her chest. "We're okay," she said quietly, and this time she believed it. Ronan appeared in Lucia's life the way he had promised, steadily, without drama, without the weight of expectation. The park visits became a structure, 2 weeks apart, then once a week through the summer, as Lucia got older and started doing things worth showing up for, holding her head up, tracking faces, the beginning of the social smile that arrived at 2 months and made everyone who saw it feel, obscurely, like they had done something right. He showed up, every time, on foot, appropriately dressed, for wherever they were meeting. Not with gifts that were too large or gestures that were too pointed. Just there, on the bench, or the blanket, or the patch of grass, with his full attention on his daughter and the appropriate distance from her mother. Alessandra watched this from the near distance of co-parenting. She did not soften toward him in the way that stories sometimes required, the dramatic re-softening, the recognition that change had occurred, the door opening again. She was not interested in that story. She had written herself a different one. But she noticed. The way a person noticed when something they had believed was fixed turned out to be moving slowly, imperceptibly. The way the light changed through the seasons, the way a child changed between one Tuesday and the next. Ronan was becoming something she hadn't seen him be before. Not reformed, not redeemed, those were words that belonged to a different kind of story. Just present, accountable, willing to sit in a park for an hour and hold a baby who didn't know him yet and not ask for anything beyond that. It cost him something. She could see that. But not asking cost him the most. He was a man who had spent his whole life demanding, securing, controlling the variables. Sexing himself, sitting in the uncertain territory of earning trust from someone who was not obligated to give it, that was a different kind of work than anything he'd done before. She watched him do it. She did not give him credit for it out loud. But she stopped bracing for the moment he would stop. The Celeste situation resolved in October. She pled guilty to wire fraud and conspiracy charges, the original fraud charges, and the expanded charges from the Ritchie family contact. The plea came after months of legal maneuvering that had progressively run out of room and was entered without fanfare on a Tuesday morning in federal court, in front of a judge who had heard dozens of cases like it and treated it with the appropriate lack of ceremony. Ronan was not in the courthouse. He heard about it from Hadley, who sent a text with the single word, "Done." He was at the park when the text arrived. Lucia was 8 months old and had recently discovered that she could express displeasure with the wind by shouting at it, which she was doing. He was sitting on the bench watching her do it with the specific helpless affection of a parent, observing something objectively ridiculous. That is also the best thing they've ever seen. He pocketed the phone without responding. The wind kept happening. Lucia kept shouting at it. He laughed a real laugh, quick and rough, not performed. Alessandra, sitting on the other end of the bench with a coffee she'd brought from the place on the corner, looked at him. She did not say anything, but she did not look away immediately, either. It was the first time she had looked at him in something that was not assessment or management, even for a moment. The first time the look had no purpose other than to see what was there. What was there was a man she had known and not known. A man who had failed at the most important thing and was living in the aftermath of that failure with more honesty than she had expected. A man whose daughter was currently shouting at wind with complete conviction. She looked for a moment. Then she looked back at Lucia. "She's going to be a problem," Alessandra said. "Absolutely," Ronan agreed. Lucia looked at both of them, apparently satisfied that she had made her point about the wind, and settled back into the complicated work of examining a leaf she had found. The year turned. Lucia's first birthday was a small party in Rosa's apartment. Rosa's apartment, not a rented event space, not the mansion, not anywhere that required performance. 8 people and a chocolate cake and a balloon Lucia was suspicious of and then delighted by. Ronan was not at the party. But the morning after, he met Alessandra and Lucia in the park on a cold Saturday, both of them in heavy coats. Lucia in a snowsuit that made her look like a small, furious marshmallow, and he brought a single wrapped gift that was appropriately sized and age-appropriate, which meant someone had either advised him or he had educated himself, and Alessandra suspected the latter. Lucia unwrapped it with the focused destruction of a 1-year-old and found a wooden puzzle with large, brightly colored pieces and immediately tried to eat one. Good instinct, Ronan said. She thinks that about everything, Alessandra said. They sat on the bench together, still with space between them, still with the careful management of proximity that had defined every meeting in the preceding year, and watched Lucia investigate the puzzle pieces with the comprehensive skepticism of a scientist who had not yet ruled out that everything was food. After a while, Ronan said, "I'm transferring the development companies to an independent trust. The logistics business is going to operate under a separate management structure. Alberto is taking over operational oversight." He paused. "I'm stepping back from the day-to-day." Alessandra looked at him. "By choice," she said. By choice, he looked at Lucia. "I have a reason to be available in the afternoons." She looked back at their daughter. "That's a significant change," she said. "Yes. For you. Yes." Silence. "I'm not saying this to ask for anything," he said. "I know the difference now between doing something because it's the right thing and doing it as a transaction." He paused. "Took me longer than it should have." "It did," she agreed. He nodded. He had learned not to argue with the things that were simply true. "She's going to ask about us," Alessandra said, "when she's older. She's going to ask why." "I know. What are you going to tell her?" He thought about it for a long time. Long enough that the question had space around it. "That I made a serious mistake," he said. "That your mother was right to leave. That leaving was the strongest thing she ever did." He paused. "And that the best thing I ever did was show up afterward and not ask for what I hadn't earned." Alessandra looked at him. The look lasted longer this time. He met it, without flinching, without managing it, without the particular performance of sincerity that men who hadn't actually earned it sometimes deployed. He just met it, the way a person met something real. Then she looked away. "Okay," she said. "Not forgiveness. Not the door opening. Just okay. An acknowledgement. A small, real thing. It was enough." Lucia dropped a puzzle piece and looked at both of them with the considering expression she had recently developed, which suggested she was assembling information at a rate that should concern everyone around her. Then she picked the piece back up and tried to eat it again. Ronan stood up to take his leave. He crouched down in front of Lucia and said goodbye to her in the particular way he had developed over the preceding year, direct, face-to-face, taking her seriously as a person. Lucia looked at him and said something that was not quite a word, and patted him once on the nose. He stood. He and Alessandra exchanged the brief logistical details of the next meeting day, time, location, with the practiced efficiency of two people who had gotten good at this specific form of communication. Then he turned and walked toward the park exit. Alessandra watched him go. She had watched him leave every meeting for a year, watched him not look back, watched him walk away without the gestures that men with things to prove attached to their exits. He just went, consistently, without drama, the way someone went when they had accepted the terms of a situation they couldn't renegotiate. This time, near the park gate, he stopped. He turned. Not to look at her, or not only at her. He looked at both of them. At the bench, at the park, at the scene of his daughter in her snowsuit with a puzzle piece, at the cold Saturday morning that was entirely ordinary and was the whole of what he had. He looked at it like a man taking a photograph in his head. Then he turned back and walked through the gate. Alessandra looked down at Lucia. "Come on," she said, "let's go home." Lucia considered this. Then she held her arms up, which was that gesture she had recently developed for wanting to be carried, and which Alessandra had learned could not be denied. She picked her daughter up. Lucia immediately grabbed a fistful of her mother's hair, which was also a thing she did, and looked around at the world from her new elevation with the satisfaction of someone who has arranged things correctly. Alessandra walked home through the cold, through the neighborhood that was hers, now the bodega and the dry cleaner, the restaurant with the handwritten menu, the route she'd walked 100 times, the route that had become ordinary in the way that a life became ordinary when you were actually living it rather than performing it. She walked. She did not think about the mansion, or the gala, or the red wine on a white dress, or the sound that had traveled through a ballroom gone quiet. She did not think about the ring on the nightstand or the suitcase or the note in 3 sentences. She thought about the studio and the meeting she had Monday morning with a client who wanted their entire brownstone reconceived from the ground up, and the coffee she was going to make when Lucia went down for her afternoon nap, and the call she had promised Rosa. She thought about the things that were hers, her daughter's weight in her arms, her name on the studio door, the amber rocking chair, the life she had built, piece by piece, starting from a cab ride in the November dark with $11,000, and the address of a woman she didn't know in Queens. The morning light was coming through the narrow gap between buildings the way it did at this hour on winter days, low and gold, and briefly, genuinely beautiful. Lucia squinted at it. Alessandra felt her daughter's small hand in her hair, and she felt the street beneath her feet, solid and cold and real, and she walked toward it all without looking back. This was not the end she had imagined in the St. Regis ballroom, standing in a borrowed dress with her hand on her belly, and a decision forming in her chest. It was better. It was hers.